I'm Dr. Dave Janda. I have the honor to introduce our next speaker, who is a very dear friend of mine, Harley Schlanger. For those of you not familiar with Harley, he has been the spokesman for LaRouche since 1999. Harley has written extensively on many issues, including financial fraud, going all the way back actually to the mid-1980s in the savings and loan crisis and Michael Milliken and junk bonds. Harley has also covered the effects of banking deregulation, which we're seeing all in its glory right now, and the shift of the United States from a productive manufacturing economy to a speculative casino economy. Harley is often interviewed on radio programs and video format shows on topics ranging from financial fraud to reversing the crisis with a return to the American system of physical economics. Harley has also lectured widely on these topics on campuses throughout the United States and Europe. He can be found at LaRoucheOrganization.com. It is my honor to welcome my friend, an incredible freedom fighter, Harley Schlanger.
Hello. Let me begin by thanking Sarah Westall for her diligence and tireless work in pulling this conference together, as well as to thank all the other speakers and the technical people who made this possible. This is a crucial intervention into our current situation in which we're seeing the collapse of an order, the so-called unipolar order, that's trying to sustain itself through shutting out ideas which go counter to its narratives. And so the work that's being presented here, and Sarah's work in particular in fighting censorship, should not just be applauded, but should be backed up fully, including through contributions, through spreading the word, and through making sure that the ideas and thoughts can continue to be circulated in public debate and in the public arena. Now let me introduce myself. I'm Harley Schlanger, for those who don't know me. I've been involved in international politics since 1972. It was at that point that I first met Lyndon LaRouche. I had just completed a master's degree in European history. And in those turbulent times, the Vietnam War, the emergence of the rock, sex, drug counterculture, I found in LaRouche an honest approach to addressing something which was not just negative, not just anarchism, but which was aimed at changing history. Now, little did I know when I first joined with him the trouble that was going to put me in. But I worked with him from 1972 until his death in February 2019. And from 1999 until his passing, I was one of his national spokesmen for both the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute. Now, my message today will be highly personal, as I'm sure many others are, because I've watched and studied the power of the corporate cartels and the oligarchy in using the media for 50 years to conduct what is now called cancel culture, and that which we call censorship, but really goes beyond censorship, as I'll get to toward the end of my presentation. Now, when I say this is personal, let me make a personal disclosure. I'm on the list of something called the Committee to Combat Disinformation, which is put out by the security forces of the Ukrainian government, including the SBU, the Special Police Unit. This is sometimes called a hit list or a target list or a kill list, because some of the journalists who have been on this list have been killed. Most recently, Daria Dugina, who was blown up in Moscow. Others on this list include Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who's been the #1 on the list since July 2022. It also includes Scott Ritter, John Mearsheimer, Tucker Carlson, Tulsi Gabbard, and many others. And since July of last year, I've maintained my spot as #8 on the list. What this list says is that I'm an information terrorist, a Putin mouthpiece. Now, why was I placed on this list? Well, because I insisted that the war against Russia and Ukraine was a disaster, that it was not the special military operation of Putin was not unprovoked, but was provoked. That Ukrainians were being asked to die for the NATO goal of weakening and breaking up Russia, which was NATO's goal because the military-industrial complex or the corporate cartels behind NATO are intending to destroy Russia for the same reason Russia was identified back at the beginning of the 20th century by British geopolitics as a leading threat to the control of the world by the British Empire. Now, by saying that Russia launched the special military operation because of provocation, that made me a target. That makes me an information terrorist. Now, as you know, the official narrative is that the war in Ukraine began on February 24th, 2022. That leaves out all the events before that, including the NATO eastward motion, despite the promise that it wouldn't happen, the events leading to the Maidan coup in 2014, which was run largely by the United States and the British. And by insisting on historic truth, I am now a target, as are many of the other speakers who you'll hear at this conference. But my story goes back before this, and I want to present to you some elements of the LaRouche story, because as you will see, had something been done about LaRouche's persecution, had there been an exoneration of LaRouche, had the story actually been allowed to come out, we would have been spared everything we've seen in the last 20 years, going back to the 2001 beginning of the escalation of the security state. We would have been spared that, and probably would have had the opportunity to place the perpetrators of this secret government behind bars. Now, for those of you who know something about LaRouche, you probably know that he was targeted as a wacko, as a conspiracy theorist, long before being a so-called conspiracy theorist was a crime against the government. In the late 1970s, he was called a communist, a Nazi, an anti-Semite, an organization, the head of an organization which was labeled by the New York Times a cult and a violence-prone institution. There was a New York Times editorial in 1976 by A.M. Rosenthal, who at the time was the editor of the New York Times, which said explicitly, LaRouche and his organization should never be mentioned in the press unless it's identified as a violence-prone cult, Nazi, anti-Semitic organization. Never should be covered. This was explicitly stated in an editorial. Now, what got LaRouche in trouble going beyond 1976 was his consistent exposure of the role of people like Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Samuel Huntington. The Trilateral Commission controlled disintegration project, which was brought in under Jimmy Carter and continued in the Reagan administration by Vice President George H.W. Bush. But the biggest crime to this establishment that LaRouche committed was being brought in by the Reagan administration, first through the CIA and then the National Security Council, because of his advocacy of something called, which became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. The idea of using new physical principles of laser technology, electron beams, and so on, as a defensive capability against nuclear attack, which President Reagan, in his famous March 23, 1983 speech, said would render nuclear missiles impotent and obsolete. That idea came from LaRouche, along with Edward Teller. And Reagan, through the National Security Council, deployed LaRouche as a back channel to meet with Soviet military officials to discuss whether they would accept that if Reagan adopted it. And so LaRouche in 82 and early 83 was meeting with the Russians, and he was told to send a message back to Reagan that the Soviets would reject the offer because they wouldn't They didn't think that it would be allowed to be made. And because of the relative strength of the U.S. economy compared to the Soviet economy, it would give the U.S. a strategic advantage against the Soviet Union. So they rejected it. But this didn't stop Reagan. On March 23, 1983, Reagan shocked the nation at the end of an address when he called on the Soviet Union to join him in adopting this policy of an anti-missile defense system to move the world away from that of the policy of mutual and assured destruction from the Rand Corporation and people like Henry Kissinger from the 60s, the Dr. Strangelove idea. Reagan was trying to break out of that, and he was using LaRouche as an intermediary with the Soviets. This drove Kissinger crazy, but more importantly, the establishment that ran Kissinger went crazy. A letter was sent by British MI6 in 1982 to Kissinger and others calling for a full investigation and prosecution of Lyndon LaRouche as a likely Soviet agent. Kissinger went to William Webster, the head of the FBI, and this was the beginning of the official Get LaRouche Task Force, which had already been underway through a prominent an individual in the financial community named John Train. It included media such as NBC running slanderous attacks on LaRouche. But after Reagan made the announcement, Moynihan, Senator Moynihan, a Democrat, and Republicans joined together in the Congress calling for Reagan to have nothing to do with LaRouche. And this began a whole series of escalated attacks on Lyndon LaRouche. Now, what made this even more dangerous for them was that our political organizations started gaining significant traction with voters, beginning in 1986 with the primary election victories statewide for Lieutenant Governor and Secretary of State in Illinois, where we won Democratic primaries. In 1988, we won the Harris County, Texas Democratic Party county chairmanship. One of my associates won that. This danger of LaRouche gaining traction with his ideas, which were explicitly targeting the establishment, caused them to escalate the Get LaRouche Task Force. And eventually, in 1988, there was a case brought against LaRouche that they used Boston as the location. You know who the attorney, the prosecutor in that case was? Robert S. Mueller, the same Mueller who later headed up the investigation against Donald Trump and the charges of Russiagate. Now, there was all sorts of shenanigans pulled in this case, including constant media lying, charges that we were defrauding our contributors, that, again, the anti-Semitic charge, and so on. And in 1987, the court in Boston started issuing fines, arguing that we were not providing documents, which we were providing. We were providing hundreds of boxes of documents that the FBI was hiding. And so as the fines mounted, we were put into involuntary bankruptcy, our three organizations, which meant we could no longer repay loans. So then we were charged with loan fraud. Now, the Boston case fell apart. Mueller, as in the case of Russiagate, couldn't make the charges stick. And the judge threw out the case, claiming there was a fraud against the court being brought by the prosecution. So what did they do? They moved the case to Alexandria, Virginia, which is the home court for the prosecution. And in 1988, Lyndon LaRouche was convicted in December on tax issues, conspiracy to defraud the IRS, and so on, and given a 15-year sentence. Now, much of what I've told you so far about the LaRouche case was reprised in Russiagate against Donald Trump. The same personnel, the same intelligence agencies. And if you want to get a full report on this, there was one pulled together in January of this year by Jeff Girth, a former New York Times investigative reporter, who published a 23,000-word article in the Columbia Journalism Review called "The Press versus the President," which documents the connection between intelligence agencies, the Democratic Party, and the media in concocting the story of Russiagate. But this is the same story that we identify in the book Over My Shoulder, Railroad, which is the story of the persecution of Lyndon LaRouche. We see the same thing in the Twitter files, where some people say, well, Twitter doesn't have to abide by the First Amendment because it's not a government agency. But then, as Matt Taibbi and others proved, the Twitter files show that government agencies were intervening in Twitter to put out false stories and to censor. Now, let's go back to the question of why LaRouche was attacked. He was at the center of a fight against the neoliberal establishment, which, beginning with the controlled disintegration project of the Carter administration, run by Paul Volcker, the same Paul Volcker who worked with George Shultz and others to take the dollar off the gold standard in 1971, that LaRouche was fighting against this neoliberal establishment, which was committed to privatization, deregulation, free trade, essentially what we call today globalization under the direction of the corporate cartels. That's what LaRouche was targeting beginning in the late 1970s. And at the same time, he was targeting what became known as the neoconservatives, those who thought that the United States had a unique role in the world to impose our particular brand of democracy, which really was not democracy, but was an increasing move toward central bank dictatorships on behalf of corporate cartels. That was what LaRouche was targeting going back to the late 1970s, fighting against the International Monetary Fund, against Volcker, warning at the time of the election of George W. Bush that there would be a Reichstag fire event that would be used to usher in a new era of emergency decrees and a national security state. He warned of that in January 2001, before Bush's inauguration, and it happened on September 11th, 2001. He had many economic forecasts. One of the most important was his July 2007 warning that the mortgage-backed security bubble would pop with disastrous consequences unless we return to Glass-Steagall banking regulation, which had been repealed in 1999 by a combination of Republicans and the Clinton administration. But at the same time, LaRouche was engaged in a global battle, identifying not just the International Monetary Fund as an instrument, what today is called a debt trap. The original debt trap was the IMF policy against the developing sector. And LaRouche became very prominently known throughout the world through meetings with President López Portillo of Mexico, Indira Gandhi of India, and many, many others, conferences all over the world, talking about his idea of breaking from the collapsing dollar system, which he warned had been we'd been put into a floating exchange rate casino economy after August 15th, 1971, and Nixon's decision to end the Bretton Woods system and remove the gold reserve of the dollar. LaRouche had been warning about that from that time forward. And his warnings are echoed today worldwide in the moves for de-dollarization, to move outside of the petrodollar system, to financing real physical economic development instead of speculation benefiting the billionaires. Now, the current round of censorship, I want to go through a couple of aspects of this, because this is something that we've covered extensively, which unfortunately is not covered so much, which is that, as in the case of the Get LaRouche Task Force beginning in London, with MI6 warning of LaRouche's role in the Reagan administration, much of what we know today as censorship comes out of British institutions, especially around Ukraine. But this gets very little attention, including from the opposition forces, because of the protection of the whole British network. Now, one of the linchpins of this and ways of getting at that is to look at one of the leading disinformation spreaders who had a very brief moment on the stage and completely discredited herself, namely Nina Jankowicz, who was appointed in May 2022 to be the executive director of the Department of Homeland Security's Disinformation Governance Board. Now, I'm going to read a little bit from my article in May 2022 on what her appointment and her dismissal represented in terms of this fight against disinformation. My article will be linked somewhere in the proceedings of this conference, and I would encourage people to look at it because the broad picture in the article is that Jankowicz was deployed by a network that stretched back to World War II CIA connection to the OSS connection, then the CIA connection to the Nazi networks, the same ones we're defending in Ukraine today, and the role of Alan Dulles as a British intelligence operative within the United States in determining American post-war policy. So it's a bigger picture, but I'm going to focus now on the Jankowicz question. Now, the problem with Jankowicz was not just that she was accurately characterized by Glenn Greenwald as, quote, a despotic imbecile, a cartoon figure spouting nonstop lies, unquote. Because there were many such figures in the Biden administration, including people like Blinken, Sullivan, Victoria Nuland, and so on. The deeper problem with her is that she is an interface between British and U.S. intelligence circles which use disinformation to hide their sponsorship of Nazis. She's part of a network of what's called cluster leaders deployed under the United Kingdom's Institute for Statecraft and its sub-agency, which has since been hidden or dismantled, called the Integrity Initiative. But under the slogan of defending democracy against disinformation, the Integrity Initiative was exposed in 2018 by former British ambassador and human rights campaigner Craig Murray as a disinformation spreader, with promotion of Russophobia as its main goal. Among the funders of this Integrity Initiative were the United Kingdom's Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the U.S. State Department, NATO, and Facebook. Following the exposure of Murray and others, the Integrity Initiative was shut down, but the Institute for Statecraft continues its work, including its involvement in many, many U.S. think tanks and institutions. Now, Jankowicz personally was deployed to work with the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry in December 2016 and 17. Her job was countering Russian disinformation. At the time, she was working with the National Democratic Institute under the umbrella called the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a regime change operation connected to people like Susan Rice and Victoria Nuland, which was notorious for its role in launching the Color Revolution regime change operations, including a key U.S. agency backing the Maidan coup in Ukraine in February 2014, which toppled the democratically elected figure Viktor Yanukovych. At the center of the uprising in Maidan Square were armed neo-Nazi thugs, later becoming part of what's called the Azov Battalion. Now, to protect the myth that the overthrow of Yanukovych was the result of a yearning for democracy of the mobs in the Maidan, a so-called fact-checking agency was set up in Kiev in March 2014 called Stop Fake. This was one of the original fact-checking organizations. One of its founders, Evgeny Fedchenko, was an open supporter of the Nazi militias behind the Maidan violence. It was manned by other supporters of the Azov Battalion and was exposed in an article in The Nation magazine back before it became illegal to say there are Nazis in Ukraine, exposed by journalist Lev Golinkin, who wrote that while being promoted as, quote, a model of how to combat Kremlin lies, unquote, it was, quote, aggressively whitewashing two Ukrainian neo-Nazi groups, Aidar and Azov, with a long track record of violence, including war crimes, unquote. Stop Fake, which he's writing about, is an official fact checker partnering with Facebook. Now, Jankowicz not only collaborated with Stop Fake while in Ukraine, but accused those of pointing to its relationship to neo-Nazis of pushing Russian disinformation. She described the Azov fighters as patriots volunteering to help refugees, to back up the weak Ukrainian military against Russian aggression in the Donbass. And she covered up for their role in the murder of ethnic Russian civilians in the fighting in eastern Ukraine. So there's more to this in my article, where I then go into the role of Alan Dulles in moving Nazi networks such as Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's intelligence chief in the Eastern Front, as well as Stefan Bandera, one of the leading Nazis of Ukraine, into protection in the West for use after the war. And this is a network that goes back to the 40s, which is still being deployed as supposed freedom-loving and freedom fighters in Ukraine today. Now, so what we're looking at is an operation that goes back to the post-World War II creation of the CIA. And the connection, the fact that this is a network which is still operating today is important to note, using the same tactics that were used in the 40s and 50s during the Cold War, that were then revived after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990-91, for the same purpose, for imposing a unipolar order to protect the world of the City of London and Wall Street finances, using NATO military and institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, which worked on behalf of global central banks, to protect what's known as from Blinken as the rules-based order, which are not rules of international law, but rules that are dictated by the needs of these financial networks. Now, this is what might be called the disinformation industrial complex, was again exposed just yesterday by the admission of former acting director of the CIA, Mike Morell, that the letter describing the Hunter Biden laptop story as classic Russian disinformation was initiated by the Biden campaign. And as Congressman Jordan has put some of this testimony out, what was pointed out is that Morell said that Blinken, who was a special advisor to the Biden campaign, came to him and basically said the Hunter Biden laptop story is Russian disinformation, which sparked in Morell the idea of drafting a letter which was eventually signed by 51 top intelligence so-called professionals from the United States, claiming that this was just Russian disinformation, continuing what they were saying from 2016, that Putin wanted to elect Trump, and that's why this was done. Now, it's since come out that is a completely fraudulent story, a complete lie. But what's interesting is Matt Taibbi, in a column on April 22nd, said that what should be a major story of a Biden campaign initiative which pulled together the intelligence community and the media, just as the Russiagate story did with the Clinton campaign in 2016, this constitutes interference in an election. It's not Russia that interferes in U.S. elections. It's this intelligence connection to political parties, to the media, as the Girth story exposes, which repeatedly intervenes in U.S. elections and then tries to blame Russia for it. This is, as Taibbi said, has been blacked out by the same media, which highlighted the effort by these corrupt intelligence officials who interfered in the 2020 election. So this disinformation industrial complex continues to function up to the moment. Now, I want to point out one other aspect of what they're doing to give you a sense of why this fight is so important. These same units of NATO, the European Union, and the Department of Homeland Security, which are fighting against disinformation, through such agencies as the kill list of the Committee to Combat Disinformation and its sister organization, Mir Otvorets, which is actually the kill list. They're now putting forward a concept in Europe first, but also in the United States, which they call pre-bunking. In other words, don't wait till the lies come out to debunk them. The lies, of course, meaning anything that goes against the narrative of the globalists and the corporate cartels. But you need to pre-bunk them, by which they mean prevent the thinking that would lead to an alternative to the narrative that they're trying to push. You don't have to debunk if you can change how people think. Now, this technically is called brainwashing. There's no other term for it. As the example I gave earlier, an element of this is that you have to convince people that nothing occurred before February 24th, 2022, so that you can continue the narrative that the Russian special military operation was unprovoked. That is, that Putin had an intention to destroy Ukraine, and that's all that's involved in it. So if you bring up the Maidan, the role of Victoria Nuland, the $5 billion spent by the U.S. to pull off that coup, the role of the Stop Fake and the narrative controllers to wipe out any story of Ukrainian Nazis, and the killing of civilians in the Donbass, all of that has to be expunged from the memory. That's what pre-bunking is. And this goes back to the story in 1984 of what was the role of Winston Smith, the lead character in Orwell's novel. He worked in an agency which rewrote history, which went back into the newspapers and rewrote stories from the past to correspond to the line of the present. That's what pre-bunking is. And if you stand up against it, you're treated in the same way, essentially, as Winston Smith, targeted for death, targeted as a kook, a conspiracy theorist, a white nationalist, an anti-Semite, a racist. That's why we have to fight, because this is not just censorship. It's censoring ideas. It's creating a unanimity of thinking, which does not allow for debate or discussion. Just as the U.S. State Department and the British and NATO rule out the possibility of negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, they are acting to make sure that nothing gets in the way of perpetual war. And by perpetual war, I mean Ukraine and Taiwan is next. They're trying to carry out an attack on the nations that are committed to sovereignty and are leading the rebellion of the global south against the collapsing dollar order. So that's why we have to fight. This is the fight that Lyndon LaRouche launched in the late 60s, that I joined with him in 1972 to carry out. So our job is to continue to fight to expose this, including its roots. It's not just corruption. It's not just conspiracy. It's brainwashing. It's a shutdown of the public arena for any discussion of the future. Two other elements I would just bring up as part of this fight. One is freeing Julian Assange. The fight to put Assange, to kill Assange, which is being continued by the Biden administration with full collaboration from the British and NATO. This is an example of the corruption that we're talking about, that you target the messenger and ignore the corruption that was exposed. Instead of demanding there be some kind of consequence for the lawbreakers who commit war crimes, killing, as in the case of Afghanistan and Iraq, instead you attack the journalist who exposes it, or the publisher in this case who exposes it. And alongside that, what's long overdue is the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche. Former Attorney General Ramsey Clark, who was LaRouche's attorney on appeal, said that the LaRouche case represented the most serious case of long-term prosecutorial misconduct that he'd ever experienced. And remember, he was a former attorney general. The facts of the LaRouche case, as I've just outlined in narrow detail today, they're available because what they show is that the networks that we're fighting that are involved in censoring and lying and control of the media today have been at it for a long time. And the richness of the material that we've presented over the years can be used to bring to account the corrupt officials who use censorship as a means of preserving their unipolar order. So again, I thank Sarah for this opportunity to address you, and I'm available for any of your questions. And if you want to reach me, you can always reach me at my private email, personal email, which is harleysch@gmail.com. And you can find my work with my daily video update at the LaRoucheOrganization.com. So thank you very much for your time.